hit the record button. All right, so for the sake of the recording, I'm Mike Tugeron. I'm the organizer of the San Francisco PHP Meetup Group. Tonight's talk is going to be Varnish, how to cache your dynamic pages. Hopefully everybody will pick up a little bit of something. I haven't given a presentation in about a year, so I might ramble a bit. If you got questions, interrupt, ask them. This is for everyone's benefit, not for me to just give some sort of spiel and you just to listen. To start with, who doesn't know what Varnish is? Let's start with that way. All right. So everyone else knows what Varnish is? Really? Wow, I'm impressed. So for those that don't know, I'm not going to read off the slide, but there it is. It's basically a web caching, or they call it an application accelerator. It allows you to do a lot of cool caching stuff, some reverse proxies, some neat stuff that you'll see in a little bit. Who all is using Varnish? All right, so do you use it a lot or a little? A lot? Great. So I'm going to look like a fool when you tell me how I'm doing things wrong. No. Really, if you, again, ask questions. If you feel something's wrong, spit it out as well. You know, the goal is to get everybody to learn something. Dynamic pages. Every website is dynamic for the most part. But a lot of people, I find, don't think that it can be dynamic because the content or it can't be cached because the content's dynamic. It changes on a regular basis. But one of the things you got to think about is how often does your page change, or how often does a portion of your page change? You take something up here like IGN's header. That doesn't ever change. That's a very cacheable piece of content. You take ads. We'll see about that. But you have we have some slotted content, some more ads. We have some comment counts on the pages. So there's a lot of pieces of data that change and could be different based upon whether or not it's user specific or not, how often things come out. And so we start looking at what can be cached on this page. So until a few months ago, IGN did no front-end caching. It was all just data caching and memcache, and then we'd render the HTML, spit out the PHP page. We started breaking down the pages with a project that Nick, somewhere around here, there he is in the back, he's given a talk at one of these, with our new framework, started focusing it on Varnish caching and ESI. But we've taken it back to our home page and other pages and looked at what's actually cacheable. And stuff that we used to think is not cacheable, turns out it is. Ads. You think you want to serve up a different ad for every single thing, but most ad platforms are JavaScript based. You may have to do some backend processing to put certain variables up into the ad, but those generally change per page, not per view. So if that's the case, that becomes a cacheable piece of data. Comment counts, well, that changes quite frequently, probably, if you're lucky. It's a good problem to have. But a lot of people use things like Livefire and Discuss. Those, again, are JavaScript-based applications. And so to display the comment count here, that's actually JavaScript on the page. So again, that piece of data can be cached. I'm sorry? Or an iframe, yes. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to load it dynamically that way. Recent articles. So this is one that a lot of people always are like, oh no, we can't cache the articles because it changes. But how often do you really publish new content? Usually it's every couple of minutes at the most. Frequently it's a half hour, 20 minutes, something of that nature. So it actually has a cacheability to it. It just may not be as long as these other portions on the page, or vice versa. Popularity can be cached for a really long time, but perhaps the recent articles cannot. So what's important is as you break apart your page, to think about what each page is, how cacheable is it, and how long can it be cached for. So on IGN, we cache the outer frame for 2 minutes, and we cache the articles here for just a few seconds. And the reason we do just a few seconds is it prevents the stampeding herd. So if we suddenly get 10x traffic, that couple of hits are all going to be to the same content. They're going to see the same thing. But we go very short TTL, even though our articles come out every few minutes is because we do A/B testing on the headlines. So we don't want, if we were to cache that for, say, 2 minutes, our A/B testing wouldn't work because for 2 minutes everybody gets the same thing. So in that case, we go very short TTL. But the rest of the page is very dynamic, or very cacheable as its own. As an example, using Varnish, we took it from 35 servers down to 15 servers running the main part of IGN. And the way that you're able to get those portions of the page cached is using a technology called ESI. Does anyone not know what ESI is? Okay, so it stands for Edge Side Include. It's a standard that's used by companies like Akamai, Squid, Varnish. Basically, you're able to put a tag into the HTML page that the applications like Varnish or Squid or even Akamai do is it takes that tag and makes a separate request to grab the data so that you can have different caching times. So again, the outer page may be cached for an hour, but this portion of it is called in by an ESI and is only cached for a few seconds or whatever. So breaking the page up into fragments is really important if you're going to use the ESIs. A couple of things to note about Varnish with it is ESIs are serialized. So that means that it makes one ESI call, waits for it to finish, makes the next call, waits for it to finish, and makes the next call, and so on. So if you break your page up into 20 ESIs, you may actually get a performance hit because it has to make so many serialized calls, that adds up. One of the nice things is you can configure the depth of ESI calls. So an ESI can call an ESI can call an ESI up to a configurable depth set. Varnish has some limitations of what it can't do. It doesn't support alt and on error. If you need those sort of technologies, perhaps, or those options, perhaps another technology would be useful for you. The other real big gotcha that a lot of people miss with ESIs, especially in Varnish, is you can't have an ESI call set a cookie for the main request. I know that's all kind of vague stuff right now. We're going to dive into the Varnish configuration in a bit and talk about what each of those things mean. I just kind of want to get out that overview with it. Any questions about what ESI is? Yeah.
As a general rule, is an area of the page that is within ESI cached for a shorter period of time than the surrounding area?
No, it could go the other way around. It could be that the, so if we were to make the popularity here an ESI call, we would actually cache this for, say, 4 hours, because popularity isn't going to change that often. But perhaps the rest of the page is only cacheable again for 2 minutes, so that way there it misses on that, but when it goes to grab that content, it's still in the cache, so it doesn't have to do that extra processing. Does that make sense? All right, cool. Installing Varnish is super easy for those of you on OS X. Hopefully you're using something like Brew or Homebrew or Mac ports or something of that nature, but using Homebrew, it's just brew install Varnish and you're done. On Linux, you got yum install, apt-get install, or you can go get the release, build it yourself. There's not much to it. So the VCL is the Varnish config language. It's basically where you set up your configuration for what's going to happen within Varnish, how it's going to handle the requests and what it's going to do. And kind of the main methods as I look at it is you have your VCL Receive, which happens at the beginning of the request. You have your VCL Fetch, which happens after the response comes back from your backend. You have VCL Hash, which is how you create a cache key if you need to not use just the URL as the cache key. Let's say there's other pieces of data you need to include, you do it in there. VCL Deliver, that happens after a cache object, or just before a cached object is being delivered back to the client. And VCL Error is where you deal with some of your error handling, how you want to show up 500 errors, things of that nature. There's a whole lot more that you can do. Not going to get into the depths of each one here, but check it out, learn more about what you can do with those ones. At a very high level, VCL Receive, this is how you configure your backends, see what backends you can use. We're going to come back and talk about backends a little bit when we go through the code. But you can have different URL patterns, different domains, use different backends. So you can split up your farm if you wanted to. You can manipulate or remove cookies coming in from the request before it goes to the backend. This is really helpful for Google Analytics drops a bajillion and one different cookies on the page. Those cookies don't change the way your page is rendered. So if you can strip out those cookies, they don't remove from the browser, but they remove from the request going to the back end. It increases your cacheability because you're not going to have a different one for every single user. It becomes more of a standardized request. Same sort of thing for the headers. So headers that come in, for the accept encoding header, is it going to support deflate, gzip, or any of those sort of headers that may come through from your from your CDN or wherever it happens to be coming from. You can either add new ones, remove them, or change them to help standardize the requests so that the more requests come in are more likely to be the same than different from each other. Request standardization, that's actually just manipulating the URL. So Varnish takes the URL, boom, there's your hash for your cache key. But what if you have the order of the parameters is different, or let's say sometimes you have page equals 1 or the page equals 1's not in the URL. You can adjust the URL so that it comes up, so it's basically, again, it's standardized so the cache key is consistent so you get a higher hit rate. Yeah?
When you're talking about standardizing the request to increase the cacheability,
Mm-hmm.
are you talking about increasing the cacheability within Varnish or for something upstream?
Either. So you can, the cacheability within Varnish so that when Varnish goes to look up the cache key, it finds more requests that match to that cache key. It doesn't push that change up to the browser as part of the VCL Receive. You can do that in the VCL Fetch, changing headers. But what that allows, if you have, let's say, Akamai in front of your Varnish, if you've standardized your requests coming into Varnish, you can push those standardizations back up to the edge and have them use, based upon the response it gets back, different cacheability for the edge side, not on the CDN. Did that make sense? It doesn't.
So I guess maybe I'm confused. Which direction is upstream versus downstream?
So in the receive, this is the browser is sent a request and it hits Varnish. The first thing that happens is it goes into VCL Receive. And this is where we're doing the manipulation of that to passing down to the backend, to your PHP servers, your Ruby servers, your Java servers, whatever it happens to be in there. And that's the manipulation we're doing here inside of VCL Receive.
I guess super simple question. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
Are you saying that the browser is the most upstream item or the downstream? And your server is upstream or downstream? Which are we talking? What direction are we talking about when we're talking about upstream and downstream?
So upstream would be the browser, downstream would be your backends. Yeah.
I always had that backwards in my head because I thought of content flowing from your server.
I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think I'm probably wrong. Just need to agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. VCL Receive is also where you set up cache bypassing. So if you have a set of rules where you want to skip the caching for some reason, VCL Receive is where you do that. VCL Fetch, as we mentioned, that's when the request comes from the back end. It goes back into Varnish. And again, this is where you tell Varnish, yes, I want to do some ESI. You can manipulate the headers that came back from the back end. You can manipulate cookies that came from the back end. One of the things that if you want to manipulate cookies, you really need to be using this live VMod header. It's a Varnish mod header. Basically allows you to treat the set cookie responses as an array, because otherwise Varnish recognizes just the first set cookie header, even though there may be, say, 10 of them. You can only manipulate that first one. Using this VMod, you can actually manipulate all of the set cookies that come back. So that's really, really handy. This is where you can set your vary for the cache. So it may be vary on user agent, maybe it's vary on the encoding type. I don't know. Maybe it's a vary on some sort of region header you've set, some sort of cookie value. You can define those. And this is where you can manipulate or set cache times if you didn't get a cache time back from the back end. So proper way to do it is in the back end, when it processes a request, it sends back the cache control header says, you know, max time 60 seconds, max time, you know, 4 hours. But perhaps for some reason you're dealing with a legacy application and not everywhere is sending back that header. You can do a catch-all and say, you know what, if I got a response back that doesn't have a cache time, cache it for 5 seconds, or you know, something of that nature. So you can manipulate those sort of things. Any questions about those two? Yeah.
On the bear, you said that things get buried in the user agent. Does that mean there's a different cache key for each user agent request?
By default, Varnish creates a different cache key for every user agent. The other way around. It doesn't vary on user agent, but a lot of times you want to vary on user agent. And so if you did, it would create a cache key for every single one. And there's thousands of them out there. So one of the examples we'll see here in a minute talks about how you can manipulate the user agent comes in, set a header, and vary upon that X header. So you can consolidate things down where all of these browsers, well, we'll get to it in desktop, you know, mobile, iOS, that kind of thing. So we're going to take a look at some code, if that's good with everybody, because code is a good thing. So your VCL is basically, it's a text file. You can open it up in any editor, and you can start editing it. You can set a probe for the backend, and this is what Varnish will use to check to see if the backend is healthy. Is this server up? Is this server down? If you have only one server, you know, it's easy to do. If you have a whole bunch of servers like IGN does, you're going to have to check a whole bunch of them to make sure they're up so you don't send requests to bad servers. You can define individual backends. So this is my localhost backend. When I use that backend, it goes to localhost, goes on this port. I have a widgets backend. It also goes to localhost, but it goes to this port instead. For an example we're going to do, I actually set a backend for Google. This is one of Google's IP addresses. We're going to use that as an example for how you can proxy somewhere else that's not even your own site to get content. And then I just have 2 fake servers in here so that I can show an example of this director. And basically what the director says is the default director, it's going to do a round robin between these 2 backends. So it's a way of rotating through them. You can also do a random backend. And there's a third option that I can't remember what it is, but this is all in the Varnish config docs. To use. So if you have multiple backends you want to, or multiple servers as part of one backend, you would use a director in order to define what those are. For a security thing, we want to define an ACL. Everybody know what an ACL is? Access control list. Can be multiple things, you know, 10.0.0.1 can do it. You know, so it's a variety of, you know, what IP addresses you can use for when you check the purge ACL, what can make these requests. And then we start off into the VCL Receive. So again, this is when the request first comes into Varnish before it goes to the back end. All right. We like to have a health check to make sure Varnish is up because we have a VIP in front of, you know, multiple Varnish servers. So we load balance between 2 servers in case one goes down. We're not screwed and everything going to the back end and overloading it. And so what we do is we say, well, if the request URL is for /ping, we do this synthetic error. And then in the VCL error, we say if the error code 600, actually return a 200 and the word pong. So ping pong, haha. What's that? Yeah. Varnish has a xvarnish ID that it has a request.xid, and that's an ID that Varnish assigns to the request. I like to set this back to an xvarnish xid header so that when it goes to the back end, it has the Varnish request ID, and that way there in your Apache logs or in your PHP error logs or any sort of logging, you can log that ID and compare it from the Varnish to the back end to wherever you want to go. If you pass this along, that's your unique ID for all your requests. So one of the examples of when multiple backends comes into play is I'm saying here, if the request host is for local.widgets, I want my backend to be widgets. If the request URL is for /Google, I'm going to set my backend to use that Google backend we defined, the one that points to Google's IP address. We're going to say, you know what, even though the host may have been localhost/Google, I want the request to simulate as if it's www.google.com. And then what I do is I basically say the URL, I want to regex substitute from the URL /Google, replace it with /search. Because if you search on Google, it's google.com/search q equals something. And then I'm going to pass. I'm going to bypass the Varnish cache and say, just serve up this request. Don't bother doing any of the cache logic. And then if the request is for localhost, I set the backend to localhost. Does that make sense to everybody? You kind of see the power of how you can go to different things with it? Or, yeah?
What if you don't match any of those?
If you don't match to any, it uses the default. So in this case, it would go, since I have a director default round robin, it would go to there. Otherwise, I could have done backend default up here, and it would go to whatever one's defined as the default. So we were talking about the user agent and the the bajillion different combinations. And so we created a Varnish method called normalize user agent. And we basically do a bunch of very simple checks against the user agent to kind of create some standards. And so what we do is if the user agent has mobile in it, we say the XUA is mobile, Android, blah, 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 blah. And then all the desktop ones, we define them as a user XUA desktop. And that's a way to allow us to vary on that user agent because mobile is different, iOS may be different, some of those sort of things may be different, but pretty much all the desktops work the same way. If you find we don't support IE6, stuff like that, so we don't worry about those sort of variations. And then if we don't match one of these, I have it just go ahead and vary on the user agent. That may create a lot of one-off caches, but at the same time, if somebody's not using one of these standard browsers, they're probably going to be one-off pages anyway. I do pass in curl as a user agent for curl requests. I use the Zend HTTP libcurl libraries. And so this way here, I treat it the same as desktop instead of having its own user agent. And so what I'm doing is to the request, I'm sending an HTTP header XUA. And that user header is going to be passed back to the back end. And so when I go to the PHP, there's going to be a header called XUA. Where were we here? I do a check to make sure that it's one of the domains we're expecting. And I do a pass if it's not. That could be for some reason, again, this is something a little more specific to what we're doing. But let's say you're starting to move parts of your application over. You want Varnish in front of parts of it. You don't want to do all of the processing, the cookie substitution, whatever it happens to be. So you define the sections of the site that you want to just skip the Varnish cache and go back. It's still proxied through Varnish so that you can change it later, but at least that way there you have a little bit of flexibility with that. Surrogate capability is a header that is for these sort of accelerators and caching technologies, Squid, Varnish, Akamai, and I'm sure a lot of the other CDNs support the same sort of thing. We're basically announcing that, hey, this is Varnish and we support ESI 1.0 tags. We use that on the back end inside the PHP to say, well, if the request supports that tag, I can go ahead and do ESI tags. If the request doesn't support it, I'm going to go ahead and do inline processing to generate generate that HTML like I would have otherwise. That's really handy because then in a situation where you hit the page and you're not hitting it through Varnish, you'll still see the full set of content. You're just not taking advantage of the Varnish aspects of things. So here's one of the things that we do with cookies. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically saying, does the request cookie have one of these patterns? Does it have the cookie name region cookie? And does it have a numeric value? And if it does, I go through and I process and I say, yes, I found a region cookie, setting that X header so that the backend can know about it. I unset those headers because the temporary ones I use to do the manipulation, because you don't want to be passing around a bunch of headers you don't need. And then if I don't find that cookie, I'm bypassing the Varnish cache. So that's a good situation where if you're serving up region-specific content and you don't know what region the user wants, they don't have the cookie, you can pass them through the back end, do your set logic, do all your processing, redirect them to whichever domain you want, set that cookie, and the next time they come in, they'll have found it and they'll get whatever cache version you had with that. I use region as an example. It could be any number of other things where you have some sort of cookie that determines what happens. A best practice that we've been using is if the URL has /private in it, we're going to bypass the Varnish cache. So that's assuming things like our login, logout pages would be like ign.com/private/logout/private login, because those are pages that are either user specific, so /private settings, or there's some sort of processing where Varnish caching just doesn't make sense. So that's just a practice we use to bypass that. When you set up your own site, you're going to find those pages that you want to skip the Varnish caching. So come up with whatever standard works well for you. I'm pretending that myauth is the cookie for the user. So one of the things, the most dynamic part of the page that's really hard to come up with a cache for is user-specific content. If it shows user friend lists or pieces of that data, it may be one-off caching. So when I view this page, I create a cache. When you view this page, it creates a cache. When you view this page, it creates a cache. And all of a sudden, you have all these one-off pages that nobody else is going to use that cache for. So instead of taking up your cache, using up your memory, it may be easier to just pass the user on to the back end and have them just bypass it. That's a real quick, easy way to deal with the dynamic user content, because let's face it, unless you're a social network, the vast majority of your visits are from anonymous users, not from logged in users. Does that make sense to everyone? So a quick, easy way you can put it in to deal with 90% of your traffic is logged in users, just skip the cache. Everybody else, let's hit the cache, and that way there you've all of a sudden offset a good chunk of your traffic onto these Varnish servers without having to deal with the really big problem of how to deal with the one-offs for users. Yeah?
Even in the one-off user condition, you can use the SI, right, to cache.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, for user-specific stuff, if you can, use ESIs or use JavaScript requests to fill the page. So back to the... No, it's a good point, sorry. The sign in or register up top here on IGN, this is actually done via JavaScript. So an AJAX call happens, it checks to see if the user's logged in that AJAX call, and then it manipulates the DOM and shows something different there if you're logged in. And that way there we didn't use an ESI for that, but that very well could be used as an ESI as well. The trick, one of the things is if you do each ESI for the logged in, it starts to add up. Yeah.
I was just going to say that one thing you have to watch out with if you do ESI for personal stuff is the serial. The fact that Varnish says serial stuff, that's become a little problem. So we end up doing client side more than ESI tagging.
Yeah. But one thing you don't want to have happen if you are doing this sort of pass sort of hack to it for logged in user stuff, or even if you're doing an ESI for user data, if your backends are down, you still want to serve up a page to that user. It just may not be customized to them. So do a check. If the backend is healthy, okay, do that. But if the backend's not healthy, strip out those cookies that make it there. It doesn't remove it from the user's browser, it just removes it from the request going down to the backend. And so what that does is basically, I'm a logged in user, I'm viewing your site's down, the backend's Varnish is up. Well, I can't get my user-specific stuff. It's going to 500 or timeout or whatever's going to happen. But if you strip those cookies because the backend's not healthy, I'll get to that cached version and still get a decent user experience, just may not be the one that I wanted. Yeah?
What about sites that are primarily logged in users? Can you still use ESIs just for the non-customized content, and did you just strip the session cookie, or?
So it depends on if your page is, you can do it a couple different ways. You can make the ESI calls for the non-user specific stuff, or you can make the ESI calls for the user specific stuff. It just depends on how you break up your page fragments and what's there. There's a link later on that Redfin did that has some neat ways that they deal with their page requests that come in. There's an outer shell. Their page basically hits Varnish and is cached, and their actual page rendering is nothing but ESI calls. And so they do some manipulation on the URL to tell the servers to treat the user, this piece of content logged in or not. But everything is an ESI call. And they create the dynamic customized pages, using nothing but ESIs. Did that, I know that's not really answering your question,
No,
but.
it does. It's just, you can do it a lot of ways, obviously.
Yeah. If you're talking 3 out of 20 modules, do the customized stuff through ESIs because you'll have fewer of those calls. It goes back and forth. So when we talk about the standardization, we talked about the GA cookies. You don't want the GA cookies to come back through because that would make a different request for every request because everybody has a different set of GA cookies. And so we have a bit of logic here that basically says, look for these cookies and accept, why isn't this scrolling over, and set the cookie header to be these values. And so basically this strips out every cookie except for the ones that we authorize. And so that way there, back to the standardization of the request, maybe somebody has 50 different cookies because you have 50 different tracking beacons. You all come back to just the couple of cookies that you actually care about for the request. Does that make sense? And then if there are no cookies left over after doing that, we're unsetting the header. I'm going to skip over that because that's really not that important. Grace periods are really powerful in Varnish. So let's say your backend goes down for whatever reason, you're doing maintenance or what have you. And let's say you have a 60-second cache time, right? That would mean that you're, by default, if you didn't set a grace period, you have 60 seconds in which to do your maintenance and get your backend back online. That could really suck. But by setting a grace period, what will happen is the backend goes offline, Varnish will serve up a stale copy of that cached content for up to that period of time. And so one of the things that we've had in the past, our backend, we have Varnish in front of our APIs. We're SOA-based architecture. And what happened was the API servers crashed and were offline for 2 hours. But the site stayed up fine serving stale content because Varnish kept serving the grace. So stale content came straight from the cache, but the site stayed up. It wasn't the best thing, but the site didn't go down. And I think we can all agree that's really the important part.
Why would you limit the grace content to any time? Why not just make it infinite?
So you use up more memory, so you may end up having to kick more stuff out. It's a little bit more overhead that Varnish needs to keep it around for longer. You could set infinite. I don't know what the way, whether or not you set it to 9999999 or not. But yeah, you can set whatever grace period you want for your request, and Varnish will keep around that copy for that period of time. Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about Purge in a second, but Purge, as you may have heard, the 2 hardest things in computer science, clearing the cache and naming things. So if you have a tier of Varnish servers out there, you need to have a way in which to clear that cache. And so what you issue to it is a purge request. So you send a header get, a header post, put, whatever. There's another header you can send that's called purge, and that tells Varnish, remove this from the cache. So what we're doing here is we're saying if the client IP is not in the purge ACL, give them a 405 error. Otherwise, return a lookup and skip the rest of the request. We'll get into a second what the lookup looks like with the purge request, but this is what you send in to tell Varnish, hey, I want to clear out this request. The other cool, the cache control header. Does everybody know the different cache control headers? I should have asked this earlier. Anybody not know what cache control headers do? So you can set cache control private, public, a max age for how long it lives for, that kind of stuff. And you can there's even a cache control header for no cache. And so you check the existence of that header and you don't use the cache if you find that. One of the things to be careful with that is you don't want your users, if you're relying on the Varnish cache, you don't want your users to mess DDoS to you just by, passing the cache control header no cache. So you probably want some sort of ACL against that or something of that nature. And that's kind of a lot in the VCL Receive. Any questions about what we've gone over with that bit so far?
Can you go over the async encoding section?
The what part?
The async encoding?
Oh, I actually think that this is, I was looking at this, is antiquated. I think Varnish already takes care of this by default now. But it's basically saying if the request has, accept encoding, check, is it gzip? Then say, you know what, accept encoding is gzip. Because a lot of times you'll get gzip, comma, deflate, or deflate, comma, gzip, or just gzip, or just there. So all the different combinations, you could create different caches even though it's all just gzip. So instead of having 3 different combinations, you have just one. And same thing for deflate. And then if it's not one of those, we don't recognize it, so therefore we're going to remove that encoding option. Yeah?
Maybe this is something from the end of the talk, but so tell me if it is. But,
No, ask away.
if you've got a primarily logged in site,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want to deal with doing ESI, you don't want that investment, right? Do you think putting Varnish and just configuring it to handle static assets like images and CSS and JavaScript will give you any performance boost over how Apache or Nginx would serve those?
Depends on whether or not you're using the same farm as your PHP servers, perhaps. Because serving up static assets, Apache's, it's quick at that. Nginx, it's quick at serving those things up. There's not a lot of overhead. But if you want to offload that somewhere else, I mean, that's one way to do it. For those sort of assets, I highly recommend a CDN, Akamai or something of that nature. But yeah, you can cache anything in it. You're not going to get a lot of boost for caching your images in Varnish unless for some reason your backend that serves up those images is overloaded for some reason. Yeah?
So I noticed there's some VCL stuff for passing upstream authentication requests.
Mm-hmm.
There's authentication inputs. Have you played with that at all?
So the way we have it set up
Upstream is that
is if the request is sending an authorization header, that we're not going to be caching this because.
But so I have a whole bunch of static content that is really heavy, but it's only.
I'm sorry, that is very what?
Heavy.
Uh-huh.
Heavy, right? And I have basically groups of users that can access that content. So it's really, if I could cache it, it would be really helpful for the website.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there's some stuff for leveraging the
Yeah, so you look at the authorization headers, what's coming through.
This is not caching it. I want to
Right, so you
that strategy for caching.
return lookup. So instead of, this is just what we happen to do because we figure if it's behind a password, it's something specific. But you can set the lookup, tell it to look up this request from the cache instead of bypassing it, and then inside of your, wait, hold on a sec so I don't break something. You would set the hash key, so in the VCL hash, you would take whatever defines the user's being validated as part of that. I would probably recommend that in that sort of case, if it's an authorization, you still do a pass for the outer frame and then actually serve the content through an ESI request. Because you aren't going to do the username password checks inside Varnish. So whatever the authentication is, does this user really get past this piece of, past this gate in order to get the content? You're not doing those checks in Varnish, so having it as part of the outer page, you're going to lose that ability. Any other questions? All right, so shoot, this is taking a little longer than I thought. If you want me to stop, just speak up too. In the fetch, so this is after the request is coming back from the back end. Request has already come back. We got some sort of content. We check to see again if the circuit control at the back end said yes, we're supporting the ESI. In that case, we're going to say Varnish do ESI. And that basically says do the ESI processing. Pretty simple with that. By default, Varnish will use the standard cache control headers, max age, smax age, in order to set the cache time. One of the things that we don't like about that is that we may want the browser to cache it up in the browser for a number of seconds, but we want the shared cache to be for much longer. So if we were to just pass back max age, that max age would go up to the browser, and the browser would cache it for that period of time. So what we pass back is an Varnish TTL. This came from New York Times, how they are doing it. And basically, it does a check for the Varnish TTL, and it sets the backend response, the cache time in Varnish to be that time. So we can say cache control max age is 60, but we can tell Varnish, using the Varnish TTL, cache this for 2 hours. The user's browser will cache it for the 60 seconds, but any other users come in will get that same page for up to 2 hours. Does everybody understand the advantage of that? Does anybody not understand the advantage of being able to do that? All right. So, let's say it's your home page, right? Your home page, let's say you figure it updates every 15 minutes or something. If a user clicks on that page, they get it, they go to another page, they click back to the home page, do you want it to go back to your backend at all, or do you just want to serve up the page that's already inside the browser's cache? And so sometimes you want to do that. But at the same time, you may not want to set that for 2 hours. And so that's where you would use the Varnish TTL, is you tell Varnish to cache it for 2 hours. So as other users come in, they'll grab that same piece of cache content, and then their browser will cache it for that shorter period of time that you set for the standard cache control max age. Did that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's just, when I'm thinking about HTML, it's a little different than static or JPEG or something like that. It's hard for me to justify the difference in cache.
Yeah. Yeah, for images and stuff like that, I wouldn't bother with it. But let's say you have a JavaScript or CSS file that's the same name, you don't have any cache busting in your URL, anything like that, you may want to tell Varnish to cache it for 8 hours, 8 days, 2 months, whatever it happens to be, but you want the user to come back to origin once a day. So Varnish will keep it cached for that longer period of time, but the browsers won't come back to origin for it.
It also lets you manage the spread, because if somebody, if you're caching for 2 hours, and somebody pulls up the page 1 hour and 59 minutes in, they're going to also cache that for 2 hours when you just update it.
Right.
So doing this lets you manage that more effectively.
Yeah. So we do that on our forums for anonymous users. The homepage gets, people pop into subforums, come back out to the home, subforums come out to the home. So we cache part of that in the browser, and then we have a longer cache time inside of Varnish. This is an example of forcing a cache time. So static assets, you know what, I want this to be cached for 24 hours no matter what. I don't care what actually came back. I'm just saying cache this 24 hours. That's just an example. That may not be what you really want to do, but that's just, if the backend doesn't set it, you can get around it. When we get errors coming back, something's usually hiccuping, something's put into the CMS wrong, something of that nature. So we don't want the grace to be that long period of time anymore, but we do want to set a very short TTL so that somebody just mashing F5 or a bunch of people hitting that bad URL that was in the CMS don't overload the back end right away. But we don't want to, if it was a mistake, we don't want to cache that for an hour with that mistake. So this way here, we just set a short time. Again, it protects us against the stampeding herd effect with all the requests coming in. Debugging Varnish can be a pain in the ass because it all happens out on other servers. And so when the request comes back, I like to check a couple of different conditions that we have. And I like to set headers to say whether or not it was cached or not. So if you had the auth cookie, okay, no, it's not cacheable because we got a session. Or if the backend TTL isn't set, no, it's not cacheable because it didn't have a TTL. The private, no, because blah, 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 blah. Because otherwise you don't know if it hit or miss. You know, you just, Varnish served the request and you go, did that work? I don't know. And then using that VMod header, we say, if any set cookies come back, we don't care. We only care about these two cookies coming back. Any other cookies coming back, we don't actually care about them. And that's just another way of standardizing, make the request more cacheable. Because if you do cache it with set cookies coming back, you're going to end up in a situation where every user who hits that cache page gets that set cookie, whether you wanted them to or not. And then here, remember how up above we had standardized the XUA user agent? We're setting now the response back to the browser being that XUA, and we're telling Varnish to vary on the accept encoding and on that XUA header. And so that way there, it does vary based upon the browser, but it's upon that standardized browser user agent instead of the bajillion different combinations of them. The advantage of doing it, so you could set these as part of the hash, VCL hash, to change your cache key for these, but in that case, you couldn't just call one purge request and clear out all the different varies. So by having the user agent part of the vary, you issue a single purge to a URL, and it gets rid of all of those combinations as a single request. Otherwise, like I said, you'd have to build up all those different combinations and send those different combinations to Varnish to purge. With the VCL Deliver, this we talked about briefly. This is just before it gets delivered back up. I like to know which Varnish server served it, and then whether it was a hit or miss and the number of hits that it had. This is mostly just for debugging. When you're done debugging, I'd recommend taking this out because it's less stuff that has to be passed around. Here's that condition we talked about with the synthetic error for the 600. We actually say, you know what, no, this object status is a 200. Return Pong and deliver the request. Make sense? So the last two things here, VCL hit and VCL miss, are for the purge requests. So if you issued a request to purge it, and give a response of a 200 with the text purge, so you know it happened. Same thing with the miss, but this time we say it's not in cache because it was a cache miss, even though you did the purge. That way there you know what happens. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So you can define what defines a unique request, right?
Yes, you can define what makes a unique request. Be that headers, be that cookies, be that URL. Right. Yeah. Yeah, Clyde.
Why would you call purge cache?
Because when you call purge, you don't know if it's in the cache or not. Oh, you mean this part right here? That's because that's what was in the Varnish examples. Yeah. That's just their examples on how to do a purge. That's what they had, so that's what we do.
Why is that an error?
Because I don't know why Varnish does it this way. That's the way in which the request gets sent back. So it's a way to say abort processing, give this status code, pass along this message.
So error is just sort of like message.
It's probably meant for actual error handling, but you end up using it for other stuff just because of the way that it works. I don't have a good answer for that one. Yeah.
Your X-debugging headers,
Uh-huh.
are they visible to everybody? Or
They're visible in the browser, yeah.
if I go in with HTTP client?
Yeah, so that's the next thing we're going to take a look at here. Whoops, wrong.
Fix that to be visible to only a certain IP range.
Yeah, so you could say, if client.ip is in my internal ACL, easy enough. So you can restrict however you want to do it. Sometimes it's handy to have it out there for users to see. So if you say, hey, user, you're having this problem, I can't debug it. Hey, what do your headers say? And you can see that. So I have a quick example page here. And basically this PHP code, a couple of quick simple things. It sets the surrogate control coming back, sets the Varnish TTL for a day, sets the cache control public, the max age 20. So the browser is going to cache it for 20 seconds in the browser, but Varnish is going to cache it for the full day. We do this quick check for the region cookie thing. That's just a hack. But the key thing that this does is it does a sleep for 5 seconds. So if we start up Varnish, come on, there we go. And we make this request. You're going to see it's going to take 5 seconds to load this request. So then we come back to the headers here, and we say, you know what, this was a result miss. Oh, it wasn't in Varnish. Well, that's obvious. We just started up the server. So I'm going to refresh the page, load it up right away. And we'll see here, hits 1, and it was a hit. And it's varying on those headers we had mentioned. So using the ESIs, what I've done here is I've said also ESI include the source of where I want to, what I want to include. So this is an example of our blog roll on IGN. And so what that does is that pulls it into the page here where you see, it just loads it directly into the page. If we were to try to go straight to the back end without it, we got to wait the 5 seconds. Hold on here. But you'll see that that logic doesn't come up because it doesn't support ESIs. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Show source.
Oh yeah, that's good. Good call, Nick. Thanks. You'll see the ESI tag down there. It's just like if you were to put in any other tag into a page that's not the browser doesn't recognize. It's just there. It just doesn't do anything. Something that's worth noting with ESIs is that it tries to process it to the same backend that the initial request came from. So in this case, I wanted to go somewhere else. Remember how we had to show that the widgets backend was port 80, not 188? So you had to check the host for that, but it doesn't actually make the ESI call out to a different host. So I couldn't say ESI include www.google.com. It wouldn't actually go out there. It would still try to serve it from your own servers. And that's where we had that check of the host. If it's www.google.com, use the Google backend. Yeah. Go for it.
Does the source of the ESI need to be a resolvable domain, or will it just parse whatever it has a backend defined for?
What do you mean? Say that again?
So Varnish is parsing the page with the ESI include tag.
Mm-hmm.
Does the source need to be a resolvable domain?
No.
Okay.
No. I can put in here foo.bar, and it would. Yeah, it would be kind of nice if it did it that way, but I understand why, but it's not the way that it works. And what you do is you do your checks. Whoops, wrong file. It will, the host here check. You can do that to change your backend if you want it to go to a different domain. Yeah. You had a question too?
Yeah, are you essentially using Varnish as cache and a load balancer at the same time?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, by setting up different director backend with multiple backends in it, it could be a load balancer.
Is that common practice, or?
I've seen it done that way. It's probably just as good a solution as any others. Yeah. Yeah.
I think you mentioned it earlier, but you might want to talk about why you run varnishes in pairs.
Oh yeah, so we run them in pairs because if one goes down, your site's down. You know, there's no server to serve it. And the odds are once you start using Varnish, like when you start using any caching technology, you scale down the hardware behind it because you don't need it anymore. So all of IGN.com's requests could be handled off of one Varnish server. It could handle it all. But we have a pair so that if one goes down, the other can continue to serve the traffic. We can't make it so that the Varnish is down, go back to the PHP, because we simply don't run enough PHP servers anymore to handle just a standard day's load. So if Varnish isn't there for us now, the site's kaput. So it's one of the notes here is to be able to still handle a totally cold cache, and some of that Varnish will handle because it will has some stampeding herd protections in it for you. But if you're just going to get in the habit of clearing your Varnish cache, restarting it, all that kind of stuff, you're still going to have a shit ton of requests coming back to your backends, and you're going to overload yourself if you go down too far. Yeah.
Two questions. Did it ever happen to you that the Varnish died?
No, I haven't had a situation where Varnish has died. I've had a situation where I last week took out too many backend servers trying to see how low we could go. Went a little too low. Found out what we could run with, but then we took out one PHP server and went too far. Yeah.
And the other question I had is, how many resources do you need to run Varnish? Or like, what do you say for how many requests you need, such and such, amount of memory?
It depends on how many requests that you have, and how much of your data is cached. Start off simple. Start off with an M1 medium in Amazon. Just a couple. What is that? 3.5 gigs of RAM. Configure Varnish to use 80% of it, so 2 gigs. See where it goes. If it's constantly kicking stuff out of the cache, well, you probably need more memory. You're probably not going to need more CPUs. So go up to the next one. See where you're getting things kicked out. Can you tune your caching so you don't have as much long tail? If you're going to have a lot of long tail, but it's going to get hit, put in more memory. How long do you want to save it for? If you're only caching for, the slash dot effect, you don't need as much cache because you're only going to care about those hot active pages. Yeah.
You run Varnish on top of the same server?
Yes.
Cause any issues?
No, Varnish runs, Varnish is Varnish, and then your backend is whatever your backend is. It could be Apache, could be Zen Server, it could be Nginx, it could be Tomcat, it could be Jetty, it could be Mongrel, or whatever else is out there. Whatever you want the backend to be, it just makes another web or HTTP request to the backend. Yeah.
Does Varnish support HTTPS at all?
Varnish does not support HTTPS. Yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah. Terminate it somewhere else, and then, yeah, depends on, if you're dealing with credit card transactions and all that stuff, well, you can't do that, but for a standard website, we terminate at our, we have NetScalers in front of, comes in from Akamai, hits a NetScaler, and then goes back to the individual farms. We terminate the SSL at the NetScaler, and then all the traffic internally is, non-SSL. But we don't deal with credit card data and stuff of that nature, so it doesn't really matter.
What do you use for the NetScaler?
I'm sorry?
What do you use for the NetScaler?
NetScaler is the brand. They're beefy, expensive pieces of hardware. There's a lot cheaper and other ways of doing that. We just have them, so take advantage of it. Yeah.
Does Varnish provide the cache store, or do you bring your own cache to actually store the cache?
So it stores it in memory is the generic way of doing it. You can also do a file-based cache. So that's an option too. It's back to the question of your assets. Maybe you want to get them off somewhere else, and those are big.
You just bring up the Varnish instance, does it already have a backend that it provides itself?
No, there's the backends. You have to define where you want it to go for the caching.
Sorry, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, caching is just in memory, malloc. Yep. So right here, I want to give it 400 megs of memory. Oh yeah, I wanted to show real quick the example. So, whoops, 81 is the Varnish port. So you see it coming right back up, but I'm going to stop Apache. All right, so if I go to the 0088, not available. But Varnish is still up, I still get what I need. Try to go to another page that's not in the cache, Varnish is going to give you a 503. So the VCL error, this is the default error message. There's that XID we talked about. You can customize this to look as pretty or not pretty as you like. It's really up to you. Let's see here. Was there anything else with that I wanted to? Yeah, so here's an example of the purge request. So I'm going to just do a curl x purge, the location with this cookie. Okay, it's purged. So now if I try to do that index page again, it's not going to load because the backend's not there.
In practice, how quick and how many objects do you have, just on average?
I don't know. Let's look.
Question.
How many objects do we have in the cache?
Yeah, so how many objects and how quick does it take to purge the individual object?
Purging a specific URL is easy. It's quick. So right now we're doing, looks like about 400 requests a second. Varnish looks like about a 55, 52% cache hit rate. Those are coming back. We are using, we configured Varnish to use up to 8 gigs. So it's using 6.67 gigs of memory. Thereabouts. It varies based upon the events. 400 is kind of on our lower end. So, what's that? Yeah. This is Datadog, by the way. That's what we're using for graphing out. In case you're curious about that tool. So I have.
Was that just, what logs was that reading?
That was, well, that's actually a tie-in to the next thing I was going to say. Do you want me to keep going into some of the additional tools that come with Varnish and that nitty-gritty? Or do you want to ask questions, or are you bored? What do you want to do? Keep going? Yeah? All right. Yeah?
Over here when you're showing port 80 or 81 or
Uh-huh.
if you wanted to run both on, you wanted to have Varnish and Apache on the same server,
Mm-hmm.
you have Varnish on 80, Apache on 80, and somebody else?
Yeah, that's probably the best way, because you want the initial request to come into the Varnish, not to your backend. So standard requests come in on 80. It's the easy way to do it. But it's really whatever, whatever works for you. Running curl requests to clear your cache kind of sucks. Luckily, we're all PHP. This is Zen 1, Zen Framework 2. I didn't have time to write up how to do it. But you just create a new HTTP client. You set a user agent. You tell it you want to do a purge. If you have cookies that are part of your hash, do that. What URL you're purging, boom, you're done. So you can make that part of your CMS if you wanted to, so your article pages automatically clear out. You push a new article, it clears out the home page, so that, or your news page or whatever it is, so that shows up right away. I mean, you're only talking a couple lines of code to do that. So clear your cache if you can. So where did that data come from? There's a nice application called Varnish Stat that comes with Varnish. So Varnish server's been up for 13 minutes. Here's my hit rate ratio. Client number well, you can see the data that's here. So it pulls out, we basically query this in Datadog and pull this information back up to the front. Information you care about, client connections to client requests. If you're just serving assets one-to-one, you may see that. The more, if you keep a connection open, like when you just serve off AJAX requests perhaps, or get different assets, may keep it open so the number of requests per connection may go up. The literature online says you want a 1-to-10 ratio. I don't know how accurate that is. That's just what the literature says. We have some farms that are doing about 1-to-8, and we have another one that's doing 1-to-100. So both are up and fine and serving traffic, yay. Hits, miss, those are obviously really important. That's kind of the key ones out of this. That answer whoever it was question? Yeah, Nick.
One thing I read, it's kind of like an anecdote, but if you do a pass, that it's not a cache miss. So on
Correct.
effective cache rate, we got to do a little bit of math.
Yeah. So what was the next one that I wanted here? Hold on here. A couple of things I just want to point out as a thought. We mentioned using the vary header instead of the VCL hash. Makes it a lot easier to do the purge. You can do a hell of a lot with the VCL, but remember sometimes simple is better. The whole KISS thing. Get familiar with the cache control headers because you're going to be manipulating those. It's really going to impact what you're doing. And like I mentioned, make sure you can handle a cold start because that really sucks if you can't. There's some good examples out there for how to use a VCL for MediaWiki, for WordPress, and a lot of others online. So check those out. Slides will be posted. The other CLI tool is Varnish Admin. This is kind of neat because this will tell you sorry, I got to go back to my command list. You can do backend.list. Here's my servers that are in my backend. Backend. And what it'll tell you here, which is nice, healthy. Oh, this backend's sick. This backend's sick. So you can see what's there. You can do backend.setHealth. So I can manually take a server and set it as unhealthy, or set it to healthy if you wanted to. You can load another VCL. I want to make changes. I don't want to restart Varnish. I just want the new configuration, VCL.load. You get to load it into Varnish, and then you say VCL use, and it'll use that VCL then moving forward. So a lot of the admin stuff that you want to do here. Status is just, oh yay, it's running, woo! So that's Varnish admin. Not a lot, whoops, too far. There's another command you can issue that's called a ban. I'm not that familiar with it, but you should check that out as well. It's a different way of making URLs be a miss in Varnish. When you want data that's in there to not be cacheable anymore. Possibly, yeah. I don't know enough about why you would use that over some of the other things, but just wanted to bring it up as something that's out there. Varnish log, you want to know exactly what's going on. Let's check out Varnish log. Oops. So I want to see all the different user agents. So I'm going to run this Varnish log here. And right now there's no requests. But let's go ahead and load this sucker up. Got to wait the 5 seconds. There we go. And we see, okay, user agent, was this. So you can kind of use this information to tail off to somewhere else to keep track of what are your most common of this, most common of that. There's a lot of good examples online of what you can do. What cookies, log cookie requests that have cookies going to the back end. This one's kind of neat. Log the requests that take more than 10 seconds to generate. That could be useful to know with what's going on. So check that out online. We talked about Varnish Stat, the stats of how things are going. Varnish Top. I haven't found this very useful, but I'm sure some people do. So refresh. These are the top things that are going on. So it's kind of like top or MySQL top or whatever. It just shows you what's happening with the different stuff. Let's see here. Yeah, that's pretty much what I got. Any more questions about that? Any outstanding questions you wanted to know how to do something, what it would be used for? Any other generic questions? Yeah.
Do you guys use any other caching other than Varnish?
We use Akamai for CDN caching. So all of our static assets, JavaScript, CSS, all goes up into Akamai. We are looking into putting Akamai in front of our Varnish tier as well to get the HTML cached out on the edge that way. We use Memcache for caching. We also use MongoDB for some types of caching. It's a database, it's not really a cache, but for some stuff, it works. Yeah?
Do you reverse proxy any WebSocket traffic?
We do not. Yeah, that was one of the examples I wanted to show, the Google thing. What I could say, Google /Q equals SFPHP. Yay, hey, there's Google on my local host. What do you know? They'll probably get pissed off at you if you do that. But it's a decent example of how you're proxying to something else to do it. Anybody got anything else? All right, then. I'm Mike at sfphp.org or mtuseron on Twitter. For those that like examples of stuff, here's the slides. Nice, easy URL to remember. A couple of blogs and URLs that I suggest checking out if you're really going to deep dive into Varnish. Nick or anyone else who really knows Varnish, did I miss anything that you think we should bring up? All right. Well, if that's it, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.